Today, you can find American made bourbon, Tennessee whiskey, and rye whiskey in all the bars across the globe. But earlier, this was not the case. The boom of American made whiskies didn't start until the 1960s, when the US government labeled bourbon as the official distilled spirits of United States of America. Hello, namaste, welcome to the Queen's Cut. I am Kalpana and I'm here to take you through the wonderful journey called the Water of Life. Let's together venture into the world of whiskey. Are you ready? Pour a drink, grab a chair. Let's get started. America's love for whiskey came after its love affair with rum. Rum was the drink of choice for the colonial period and the beginning of American Revolution. But during and after the Revolutionary War, that began to change. Rum is made with molasses, which was imported into America through the sea. But as the settlers moved inward, it became very hard and expensive to make rum. The British government also stopped all the imports of molasses and rum from the West Indies during the Revolutionary War. So, whiskey that time was made as a substitute to rum until the regular supply of rum returned. In the 1600s, whiskey distillation was brought to North America as the European settlers and colonists traveled across the Atlantic Ocean towards America. The settlers had a surplus of grains, and many of them were the Scottish and Irish who brought their knowledge of whiskey distillation to their new homes. And they had experience in distilling grains. Whiskey could be made anywhere and everywhere as it was not dependent on any imported ingredients. Whiskey was gaining popularity in the American colonies, where whiskey production and consumption was growing drastically. In fact, whiskey became so popular in the United States that many distillers started using whiskey as a form of currency during the American Revolution. It was used as currency in the rural areas and was commonly traded for other household essentials. Whiskey also became part of many ceremonial occasions, as well as a staple at government events and political campaigns. After the Revolutionary War concluded, whiskey became a very important role in the American history and politics. The first official commercial distillery in the United States was constructed in Louisville, Kentucky by Evan Williams, whose whiskey is still widely popular. After the Revolutionary War, a whiskey tax was put up by the newly formed American government to help pay back some of their war debts. This idea of tax was not received well and created outrage from the Americans, particularly from the farming populations, who were now used to fermenting and distilling some of their unused and surplus grains into their own mash. Whiskey was a way of life for them, and they were not interested in sharing their money with the government. The opposition was strongest in rural areas, where farmers would attack revenue collectors, destroy documents, and even shoot holes in stills of distillers who had paid the tax. Several government efforts to put an end to this opposition failed, and in 1794, when a farmer named William Miller was served a writ, a notice from the court, a shot was fired. This began a rebellion. They referred to themselves as the Whiskey Boys in the 18th century. A group of 600 armed men attacked the home of a tax inspector to prevent the collection of the whiskey tax. President George Washington eventually sent out a military group of 13,000 men to handle the rage caused by the rebellions in Pennsylvania. This broke up the rebellions. There were some arrests, but most importantly, it was a defining moment in the early history of the US, showing that the law could not be ignored. After the failed rebellion, Scottish-Irish rebels moved further west to Kentucky. They began distilling with corn as well as rye in Bourbon County, giving way to what we now know as bourbon. Despite its rocky start, whiskey consumption did not slow down. George Washington himself actually started producing whiskey in 1797 in Mount Vernon. Whiskey was drunk on daily basis, sometimes even to start the day. Whiskey was even consumed instead of water, as people didn't always have access to clean drinking water, and whiskey was a sanitary option. From 1920 to 1933, the United States passed an amendment to the Constitution that made the production, sale, and use of alcohol and alcoholic beverages illegal. This devastated the whiskey market in the United States. But there was one exception made by the government, that whiskey could be procured in medicinal form from a pharmacy with the help of a doctor's prescription. This played a massive role in the growth of a pharmacy chain named Walgreens that expanded to 400 stores from mere 20 stores in just 13 years of time. While the rebellion may have ended, the whiskey tax was still a major pain for farmers. In 1802, Thomas Jefferson, who repealed the tax shortly after ascending to the presidency, which boosted whiskey's popularity all the more. It became an everyday commodity, being sold for 25 cents a gallon, which was cheaper than beer, wine, coffee, tea, or milk at home. The moral of the story? Don't mess with an American whiskey. As a relatively young country, barely around 155 years old, Canadian whiskey embodies a history that is actually much older than the nation itself. While the first documented distillery was not founded until the late 1760s, which is now at the Quebec City, the history of Canadian whiskey goes back much further. Descriptions of early Canadian and American whiskey were made by traders from Montana to Alberta, which was then referred to as the whiskey trade, is anything but enticing to the ears. The story of Canadian whiskey starts all the way back to when the European merchants joined the North American fur trade that had been going on for centuries among Canada's First Nation people. Long before the arrival of the Europeans, the indigenous people of Canada were hunting and trapping fur-bearing animals for thousands of years. In the 19th century, the French and European settlers established trades with these indigenous people who were living around them. At that time, money had no place there. Rather, the settlers learned to trade goods with natives. They often used rum and brandy to trade fur pelts, robes, firearms, food, woolen blankets, and tools with local people for selling them in Europe. These drinks were usually highly diluted and put into animal skin bags or some barrels before being traded with the natives, who referred to this drink as fire water. Soon these European traders and settlers started venturing into the whiskey business like their counterparts in the US. However, there was one major problem: quality control. While there were dozens of legitimate distilleries which were busy laying the foundation for true Canadian whiskey, the industry was already overrun by whiskey bootleggers, sometimes who smuggled whiskey from one place to another. The description of early Canadian whiskey produced by these bootleggers are far different from today's Canadian whiskey. These harmful mixtures were made from distilled spirits mixed with ingredients such as molasses, chewing tobacco, ink, yes, ink, red pepper, and even soap, which was often referred as the whoop up juice. 3 years after the Canadian Confederation, in 1870, the Northwest Mounted Police was created, specially to patrol and put an end to the many illegal whiskey troops that were rampantly peddling such mixtures to native population. And with the help of the newly assembled Canadian Mounties to police a newly established nation, it was time to enrich and empower 200 or more legitimate distilleries that were busy laying down the foundation for true Canadian whiskey, which was getting recognized as some of the finest spirits in the world. Before there were distilleries, the farmers who were the true pioneers of Canadian whiskey would set aside an ample amount of grains from their autumn harvest, which they would then use to distill their own homemade whiskey. These whiskies were carefully refined season after season and sold in the local markets. One of the best in the world. As consumers today, we are lucky to enjoy so many good, straight American whiskies which are still popular and available in the markets. The whiskies and the men who made them both have surely won a place in our hearts. Let's raise a glass to the heroes and the pioneers of the American whiskey industry. Cheers! And as we wrap up our journey through the fascinating history of the American whiskey, I would like to thank you for joining me on the Queen's Cut. Until next time, be good, drink responsibly. After all, whiskey people are good people. Cheers. Lots of love.